Welcome, writers, readers, and friends to the Authors Talking Bookish podcast. I'm Donna Norman Carbone, author of All That Is Sacred.
And I'm Hope Gibbs, author of Where the Grass Grows Blue.
We're two debut writers traditionally published by a small publishing house, bringing to you all the experiences that we as authors learn the hard way, so you don't have to.
We'll give you insights from the inception of a book idea to publication and beyond. And along the way, we'll share our love of books from the writer's perspective.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 14. We listen to them, we appear on them, and some of us create them. Podcast 2024. How can your writing career benefit from them? My name is Donna Carbone, and I am joined by Hope Gibbs. Hi, Hope. How are you?
Hey, Donna. I'm great. How are you doing?
I am well, thank you.
How is 2024 going for you right now?
2024 is going really well. Kind of settled in. I just had some midterms at school. Expecting some snow, which I'm looking forward to. I always look forward to snow at the beginning of the season. As we get to like February, I'm usually done with it by then.
Yeah, I used to love snow days when I was a kid, but not as much as a mom, because down here, if we get just the tiniest amount of snow, we shut down the entire city. But we don't usually get a ton of snow. It's more rain down here.
Yeah, I'm all about the snow days as a teacher.
Yeah.
My motto is, if it's going to snow, let it snow on a weekday and let it snow big.
I like that. And there's nothing better on a snow day than actually reading a book.
Yeah.
So Donna, tell me, what are you reading this January?
I am reading the best book to cozy up by the fire on a couch under a blanket. It's called The Echo of Old Books, and it's by Barbara Davis. This is my first Barbara Davis book, but it certainly will not be my last. I'm just going to give you the beginning of the premise of the story because I don't want to spoil it for you because I feel like it's so magical. It's about a young woman who owns a rare bookstore, and she has a magical ability to feel the emotions when she touches a book that the reader felt when they were reading the book. And so from there, like, this whole story of discovery happens, and it's just amazing. Like, I read it in 3 days, but I would have read it in one if I had the time to do it. It was just beautifully written, and I highly recommend it. How about you?
So I took a little turn. Normally I pretty much stick with fiction. I mean, I'll occasionally throw in a nonfiction book every now and then, but I was stumbling. I guess I was going through an Instagram feed or a Facebook feed, and I saw an advertisement for a new show on FX called The Feud, season 2, and it deals exclusively with Truman Capote's swans. And I had never heard of this term. I knew of him, obviously. He's a very famous author who wrote Breakfast at Tiffany's and Cold Blood. But back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, he had cultivated these women in New York society. We're talking the creme de la creme of the society world. And they became his best friends, his confidants. They would travel together. But they didn't know at the time he was writing what was going to be his grand masterpiece about high society women. And he was basing these characters that he was going to annihilate on these women that were his friends. And they had no idea what was going on. And it was the backstory about how he met them all and the ramifications, because it ended their friendships. Almost every one of the swans left him. Wow. And it was fascinating, and I can't wait. I think that the premiere is at the end of January, and I cannot wait for that show because I love the creator of that miniseries. So I'm excited.
Yeah, you told me about it, and I actually watched the trailer for it, and it looks really good. There's a lot of good people in it.
Oh yeah, it's got Demi Moore in it. Molly Ringwald's in it. There's just
yeah.
So I'm very excited.
Yeah. I have a question for you. I don't know if you know the answer to this. Did a biographer write the book, or was it one of the women?
No. It was a biographer who wrote the book. And I
He's
think
very
his name is Lawrence. I think it's Lemur, and so this is kind of this is what he does. But
yeah.
it was fascinating, and also it goes back and it gives you a little bit of history on Truman Capote. He was an incredible character of his own.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. You got a lot of history, and I love history. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I love biographies. I really enjoy reading biographies.
yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about why we're here today. Let's talk about podcast and
Yeah.
how it can help you as a writer.
Sure. What are some of your favorite podcasts?
Well, one of my favorite, is, and we know this person. She is wonderful. It's Grace Salmon. Grace Salmon.
Mhm,
She does a podcast called The Storytellers, and
mhm,
she is not only is she one of the most fascinating women, and I really look up to Grace.
mhm,
She's an incredible author. She's written multiple books, but she's really good at how she handles guests because
mhm,
she has guests who come on her podcast, and she does a magnificent job on she knows the backstories of these books, these authors, and she asks some really interesting questions. And it's just fascinating listening to it.
Yeah, she gets some really good guests as well. I listened to her interview with Marta Kaufman, who is one of the creators of the television show Friends. I loved that. I think that's one of my favorite storytellers episodes. Although I've listened to many of them, she gets people in all facets of the industry and some pretty heavy hitting writers. Grace is a very gracious host.
Yes.
I think she really does a great job of putting a spotlight on people in the industry. And she's been one of my mentors as well. I have a lot
Yeah.
of respect for her.
And
Yeah.
the woman can put together a charcuterie board because if you do
Yeah.
not follow her on Facebook or on Instagram, every Friday she puts out a charcuterie board that my mouth, usually I'm home eating a bowl of cereal at that time.
Yeah.
I'm not a big going out at night, and it always brings a smile to my face on a Friday night. So,
Yeah.
so what's a podcast that you like?
Well, I'm going to mention one that both of us were guests on, Tough Fish. First of all, I love the name of this. And Jen Milius is the host, and I just had the easiest conversation with her. It was the second podcast I had ever done, and I just kind of lost track of time. I felt like I was talking to an old friend. And she has a lot of really good guests on there, and I've gotten a lot of good book recommendations from her podcast.
Yeah, she was actually the first podcast that I ever did, and she was one of the most gracious hosts. She just and she read my book. I mean, she knew my book. She had great questions, and even after we ended, because usually when you're on these podcasts, it's being recorded, and so
Mhm.
even after she hit end, we sat there and talked. I think probably another 20-30 minutes, and she knows her stuff. She is quite knowledgeable, and if you are an author and you're wanting to promote your book or wanting to get your name out there through a podcast, I would say that was an excellent experience. She's also one of those podcasters. She did all the graphics. She would send me graphics with her logo, my picture, so I could promote it on my social media. She was incredible, and she's a very big supporter of my author Instagrams and all of that. So I really,
Mhm.
really enjoyed that experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, my very first podcast was Write the Damn Book Already with Elizabeth Lyons, who I absolutely adore. She is funny. She wrote a book called Write the Damn Book Already in it, and she is also a writing coach. And so she gives a lot of her tips there, and she does webinars, and she's wonderful to follow on Instagram because she has a lot of good tips for writers and people trying to market their books. She's hysterical, and I was so nervous because it was the first podcast I was on. So nervous because I didn't know what to expect. And she's another person who I just felt like I was having a conversation. I think I laughed just as much as I spoke on that podcast. So yeah, that's another good one to tune into.
Yeah, and one of my favorites, and So any of those who've got little children around or you're offended, I apologize, but this is the actual name of the podcast. It's called the shit that no one tells you about writing. And this is a podcast that has it's Bianca, Carly, and Cece Lyra, and they're agents and they're writers, so they know the industry like no other. And I have learned so much from this podcast. And also, they have a great presence on social media. So, if I don't have time to actually listen to the podcast, I'll, go through and they give tips. They are incredible. I really enjoy that podcast.
Yeah, I do too. And I like that they are so well connected because they have so many tips from different angles. So I feel like I'm on the pulse of a lot of things when I listen to their podcast.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. And is there another podcast that you listen to?
Yeah, the last one I want to mention is the Best of Women's Fiction. The hosts are Lainey Cameron and Ashley Hasty. I was actually a guest on the debut episode of the Best of Women's Fiction. But if you were looking for women's fiction, first of all, these ladies are so gracious and, writers in their own right. Ashley Hasty does a list called the Hasty List, which is a list of books that she's reading and recommending. And Lainey Cameron is a writing coach as well. And she has written a wonderful book called The Exit Strategy, but they really do shine a spotlight on women's fiction writers. So if you're looking for a women's fiction book, that's a good place to start.
So I think one of the big questions I'm sure authors right now is like, well, great, you've given me some podcasts, but how do I become a guest? Like, how does that work? So Donna, how did it work for you? Because you've been on several different podcasts.
Yeah, and in different ways as well. Like some people have reached out to me to ask me if I would be on a podcast. I have filled out forms on their websites. So that's a good way to check and see if they have such a thing. And, you could write like a little query letter, like a mini query letter and email them. Oftentimes on their websites, they'll have their email addresses. So many of them seek guests. And what I would do is I would, pick out a few, listen to them, make sure you like them, make sure it's a good fit for you, and then reach out to the hosts.
Yeah. And it's very important because in our show notes, you found a great article and it's just simple podcast rules. Because if you're going to be on a podcast, there are some, helpful guidelines. One of the most important thing, because I do not a podcast, but I do a live interview for Bookish Road Trip, and I interview guests. And one of the big, wonderful things is when your guests show up on time. I have been so fortunate that all of my authors, because they're professionals, and that's one thing. This, writing is creativity, and I get that. But to be a professional author out there, you need to be a professional, be on time, and be prepared. You just because you think you know what you're going to talk about, you need to, I always have notes in front of me, even if I'm talking about myself. Another thing, I know this sounds crazy, is hydrate. I always have water because you never know when your throat is going to give out on you. So you've got your water. So those little things like that. And
you know what, Hope, I want to just interrupt you for a second because you hit on something that I want to add to. You talked about being prepared, and you actually gave me a tip that I want to share with our listeners about being on a podcast, or whether you're interviewing someone or whether you're being interviewed, that if you have notes, you can put them on sticky notes and put them around the face of your computer, your screen, because we can't see those when you're being taped. So I thought that was a really good practical tip.
Yeah, I I didn't read that. It was just kind of a thing that I stumbled across to make my job easier for Author Take the Wheel, because that's live on Facebook. And, sometimes as I'm getting in my 50s, my brain sometimes doesn't work the way it did when I was in my 20s. And so the worst thing I could think of is, oh no, I'm going to forget the author's name. Or, and a couple of my authors last year had some really complicated last names. Yeah. And so I would write it out phonetically. I would always have Post-it notes of, so that way I'm also not looking down. You don't want to, so, that way I'm constantly looking at the screen. So that was, I'm glad that you liked that tip.
Yeah. I did very much. I wanted to share it with our people.
Yes. So those are kind of things, but and I always like when I've been on YouTube channels or podcasts, I
Mhm.
always send a thank you note afterwards. It can be
Mhm.
just as simple as an email, but also
Yeah.
express that they've given you a platform, and just a simple thank you can go a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. The last thing we wanted to talk about was just a little behind the scenes look at our journey in creating a podcast. Um, I can't believe we're at episode 14 already. Um, but Hope and I have been friends for 2 years. I think we mentioned some of this in the first podcast, but we just really leaned on each other for support and kept talking about the things that we were discovering about becoming published authors. And so we wanted to really hone into the theme of the things that we learned the hard way to make it easier for other people, things that we wished that we knew. And just in a conversation, we just kind of came up with the idea of having a podcast.
Yeah, I will say this. Donna was really she's the brains behind all of this. Donna was the one who kind of really brought it to fruition, and she brought me on. And the first person that we reached out to was, as we talked about earlier, was Grace Salmon. She could help us, figure out if this was something we wanted to do. And I remember this. We had a Zoom call. I was in Sea Island, Georgia, and she was telling us things that we had no clue about,
Yeah.
and she really guided us, and she was instrumental in getting this thing started.
Yeah, which speaks to the idea of, networking as an author. I think it's important to network and make connections with people because you never know. Like when I first met Grace as the writer of the book The Eves, and
Mhm.
she was being interviewed on a book club that I am now a tour guide for, and so is Hope. So,
Yeah.
you never know like how your networking is going to help you down the road.
And that was the first time I met her, because you and I, that was our first book club that we had
Mhm.
ever joined for Bookish Road Trip. And I was lucky enough to be the winner that night of the autographed
Of the
book.
book, yeah.
And I was so excited because, I was still a year and a half out before my book was going to be out there. I had just signed my
Mhm.
contract. But Grace was one of those people that really showed me how, as an author, to pay it forward.
Yeah.
And, I've had so many authors, do wonderful things for me. And I am now able, even though I've only had one book, but I've been able to pay it forward to other people that are thinking about writing, people that are still, trying to look for a publisher or an agent. And I think that's one thing about being a writer is, writers want to help you. And
Mm.
just remember that when you get into a position where you could help someone else. So,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. So we're coming up, getting ready to
yeah.
wind this one down, but we've got a kind of a fun, exciting announcement about our podcast, because, I think that's the one thing, we're constantly trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. And so Donna and I are trying to do something different in 2024. Donna, do you want to tell everyone?
Sure. We are super excited. We're going to start to host some guests. Um, Occasionally, not every single week, maybe every third episode or so. But we want to choose from like a pool of, people who represent different facets of the industry. Um, Bookstagrammers, influencers, agents, maybe small publishers, writers, readers. Um, so, Hope, do you want to tell everybody who our first guest is going to be?
Well, we've spoken about her a lot. I feel like that this
Yeah.
might be. I feel like we might need to title this podcast as Grace. Grace is coming to be our first guest, which is
Yeah.
going to be our next episode, and we're going to discuss with Grace not just about being an author, because she's an author. She's written multiple books. She's written one fiction, but she's written multiple nonfiction books.
And
Um,
she's also edited
yes.
three nonfiction books that we recommend all the time, which we'll let her tell you more about next week.
And then she also, has her own podcast. She
Mm.
is really, been a huge influence on us. And, and that's the thing, again, I loved about Grace was she is so giving. And that also can help our aspiring writers or our current writers to know that grace actually extends grace to others. And so, so I'm very excited. I'm also excited that we're going to put on our website a form to fill out. Now, Donna and I have, we've got guests already scheduled and we have lots of connections, but we'd like to hear from you. If you are an influencer or you're in the publishing business, or if you're a reader, we would love to have you come on our podcast and, give us a different insight into publishing and books.
Yeah, I'm super excited. I think this is going to add to our podcast.
I do too. I think so too. So as we're wrapping up, as our teacher, as I love to say, what's our homework from this episode?
I really think just start listening, finding some podcasts. Hopefully ours is on your list and stays on your list, but finding some podcasts that you can potentially learn from and also potentially be a guest on if you are someone who is planning on writing and publishing a book in the future, because it's a great way to let readers know about your book. So just listening to podcasts and writing down things that you could apply to your own career.
Yeah. Or if you want to start your own podcast, be thinking of ideas on how to do that and all the research. So, okay, Donna, well, this was so much fun and I cannot wait for our next episode because that's going to be a very special one. That's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think so too.
Well, everyone, until next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm Hope Gibbs.
And I'm Donna Norman Carbone. It's time for you to get to work.
We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks with another tip from your author friends.